One of my favorite styles of commander decks are those that have ways to break the rules of the format. Few things are more gratifying to the creative mind than giving the proverbial finger to the game rules. Now, normally in Commander, we can only include one copy of each card in our deck that isn't a basic land, but there exists a cycle of cards that break that rule and have text on them that permits us to run as many of them as we'd like. We've already seen the black version of this in the Shadowborn Apostle, the blue one in Persistent Petitioners, and the red one in Dragon's Approach. Now, while we've yet to see the green part of this cycle, Foundations brought about the white part of the cycle in Hare Apparent. This cuddly 2-mana 2/2 Rabbit Noble has an enter ability that creates a 1/1 white rabbit creature token for each other creature we control named Hare Apparent. A deck may contain any number of cards named Hare Apparent. This is such a fun card in that the more of these we're able to cast, the more tokens each subsequent one will create. Since we're able to include any number of cards named Hare Apparent, we can apply this to our commander deck building exercise, which wants us to create as many of these rabbit tokens as possible and go wide enough that our opponents will not be able to hold off our furry onslaught. The ideal number of copies to include is 30. It's slightly less than 1/3 of our deck, but it's enough copies that we'll see them pretty frequently. We also don't want to clog up too many slots that could be filled with other value cards to help supplement our deck strategy. As for the commander, we are in a unique circumstance where many white inclusive commanders are already primed for token strategies, but we can also opt to go with the commander in a non-token strategy that has some means to get us repeat uses of the enter ability. Again, a lot of it is up to personal preference and play style, but if we can tap into our knowledge of the Shadowborn Apostle build, black inclusive commander decks open the door to a great deal of powerful cards that will work well with what we're trying to do here, including one card very unique to our deck's gimmick. For the purposes of this exercise, I want to revisit an old favorite of mine in Shugen Guard, Sire of Famine, a 6/6 Elder Demon for 3 generic and 2 black. He has flying as well as 2 other activated abilities. The first lets us sacrifice another creature to create a blood token. A blood token is an artifact token that for 1 mana we can tap and sacrifice the token, discard a card, and then we can draw a card. We'll get 2 blood tokens off of Shugen Guard should the sacrificed creature be an angel, but that really won't come into play too much with this build. The second ability lets us pay 3 mana in any combination of white and black, sacrifice 6 blood tokens, and return each creature card in our graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Those creatures then become vampires in addition to their other types. Creatures with finality counters are exiled when they die. Shugen Guard does let us lean into somewhat of a reanimator strategy, and gives us both a free sack outlet and a means to reanimate our creatures en masse. The sack outlet also gives us access to additional card draw value in the form of those blood tokens. We can use those blood tokens to discard more Hare Apparent to the graveyard, so when we eventually hit a reanimation target, we get a stronger return. An important rule to note about Hare Apparent's ability is that if we have multiple copies of it entering simultaneously, such as through Shugen Guard's ability, they will see each other and give us more tokens upon their enter ability's resolution. We do capitalize on this through some other mass reanimation spells like Immortal Servitude, Living Death, and Patriarch's Bidding to help bring back our rabbits all in one fell swoop. Since we don't really have a way to cheat the mana cost of these Hare Apparent cards beyond something like Pearl Medallion that gives us a 1 generic mana discount, we do want to lean into that mass reanimation tactic. An easy way to dump all of these cards is to use Secret Salvage on a copy of Hare Apparent after it's been sent to the graveyard, to bring all of the copies of it from our library to our hand. At the end of our turn, we discard them all, and we've effectively set ourselves up for a mass reanimation on our following turn. We are also utilizing Grimoire of the Dead, an artifact that lets us discard a card to put a study counter on the Grimoire. We can then tap and sacrifice the Grimoire after reaching 3 study counters to reanimate every creature in every graveyard under our control. Those reanimated creatures become black zombies in addition to their other colors and types. We can take advantage of cards like Phyrexian Altar to sacrifice tokens and such to add white mana to help us continue our momentum in casting additional copies of Hare Apparent. But let's discuss one of my favorite cards to use in this kind of deck, Thrumming Stone. Thrumming Stone is a 5-drop artifact that gives spells that we cast Ripple 4. Whenever we cast a spell, we may reveal the top 4 cards of our library. We may then cast spells with the same name as that spell from among the revealed cards without paying their mana cost. You put the rest on the bottom of our library. Whenever we cast our Hare Apparents with this in play, we can effectively begin a process to cast more copies until we either run out or stop hitting new copies. Each new spell we cast will also have Ripple 4, so we can dig super deep into our library with this. Since this is also a cast trigger, the original Hare Apparent we cast first will eventually enter after all the other Hare Apparents have resolved and the Ripple 4 procedure has ended. We do also have a few alternate ways to win with this deck. The most obvious way to win with this build is to go wide with our tokens and then swing in for lethal. Turning creatures sideways is a valid and straightforward way to play this deck, but we have a few other means to win that take some nuance. Altar of the Brood is perhaps the most passive but most easily accomplished. This 1-drop artifact has a single, simple triggered ability. Whenever a creature enters under our control, each opponent mills a card. If we can gain some momentum with our deck, such as the Therming procedure, we can get a huge colony of rabbit tokens into play and mill our opponents out. We also have a pair of methods to use our tokens to whittle down our opponent's life total, using tech similar to an aristocrat strategy. Corpse Knight will ping each opponent whenever another creature enters under our control, which would mean we really only need to get about 40 creatures into play after this enters, which again, not too difficult. Marionette Apprentice and the Zulaport Cutthroat both come on the tail end of this strategy to give us some death triggers, pinging each opponent whenever one of our creatures die. This can make short work of our opponents, as we can cast a board wipe to kill our entire battlefield and trigger these 2 cards enough times to close out the game. Finally, we have Mirror Entity, perhaps the only combat-centric win con of this deck. With it, we can dump excess mana into the X cost to give our entire board base power and toughness XX and make them all rabbits, to swing in for a tremendous amount of damage. This deck doesn't have much subtlety once the main gimmick is realized, but it being straightforward will also make it rather easy to pilot. You'll want to begin the game with at least 1 copy of Hare Apparent in your hand. We are on a very low mana curve, and so we're able to run a slightly lower land count. Much of the remainder of this deck is on removal and additional card draw, such as cheap draw cards like Infernal Grasp and Night's Whisper. I love exploring unorthodox strategies like this one, getting to explore a new take on a deck. We are still very much at home in token strategies, but without really the need for the classic token staples. Since our deck slots are slim, I didn't choose to include any token doublers. This deck can struggle sometimes against strategies that impact creatures such as Blind Obedience or Elish Norn. We can set up though for a very explosive turn that can possibly even win us the game after the dust settles. In the coming weeks, we may explore other variants of this Hare Apparent strategy to see if we can come to a consensus as to what the best build is. But for now, that will bring us to the end of our discussion. Are there any cards that you find spicy tech for our bunny friends? Let's discuss it in the comments. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, likes and shares are always the greatest way to help support the channel. If you're new here, remember to subscribe, and I'll see you all next video.